It all started on a misty Saturday morning. All the runners had lined up on the grassy field, and the starter had raised his hand to begin the race. At the blast of the gun, the runners took off, and like one mob, they began to make their way down this grassy field. By the time they reached the first curve, some had separated themselves, and those were destined to be the front runners. If you took time to look up, you saw the pack, and then at the very end, all by himself, was a kid named Ben Cowan. Now, Ben was not like the rest of the runners. When the gun shot off and he began to run, he did not jump out of the starting block or off the line like everyone else, but he did begin to make his way. Ben was in last place. Ben was always in last place. In fact, Ben never finished anything higher than last place, but he always ran. When you watched Ben run, you noticed something different about him. Ben had something called cerebral palsy. And you may be familiar with that disease. It's a very challenging disease. It's one of those that the spine is twisted, and as he begins to run, his knees knock and his feet drag. But he thrusts his upper body forward so that each step is able to be made. He makes his way down the grassy field while the distant pack is long gone, long out of sight. Not long after fatigue, he falls. But Ben gets up. He pushes himself up and he begins to take another step, and he continues to run, but he does not run very far until he falls again. This time, you can see the look on his face that this was a painful fall. It wasn't like the first. And even the soft, grassy, wet ground wasn't enough to brace his fall. But that didn't stop him. He got up again. And as he began to run, he made it quite a bit further this time before he fell, and this time fell particularly hard. And everyone watching wondered if one more time Ben would stand to his feet and continue the race. Those who knew Ben knew that he would stand. Those that knew him best, that had watched him run before, they knew that he would stand and continue the race, and not only continue the race, but he would finish the race. Most of the time, these races end in about 25 minutes. But for Ben, it takes about 45 minutes. As we think about his story, and we start to examine our own story, I want us to think about the what-ifs in our life. Because I believe that if you were to have the opportunity to hear Ben's story, his what-if story would sound something like this. What if you were willing to look past the limitations in your life and examine the possibilities of a life with God? You may never have stumbled. You may have been one of those fortunate people who've come into this life and you've lived a life fairly easily, and not many things have come your way that have caused you to stumble, and you made your way down this life, but you've never asked yourself that question: what if I were to look past the limitations of my experience and begin to experience the possibilities of God? When we read Scripture, I think we see time and again stories of people who inspire us because they've been those who've demonstrated for us those possibilities. They've showed up in a way that we could identify with them, and their story resonates with us in some way. And through that story, we see the greater story of God, because God's story is lived out in their experience. I believe one of those stories is this story of Peter. In Matthew chapter 14, starting in the 22nd verse. And if you have a text this morning, I'd invite you to take that. It'll also be on the screen. And let's read this story and look at the what if of Peter's life in this experience with Jesus. It says in verse 22 that immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand, and he caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. In this series, we've asked one another to jump into an experience of what if. We've asked one another to join this journey with us in exploring the what ifs of your life. What we want to say repeatedly to help us all understand is that this is not a what if experience that we can describe for the entire congregation. That this is a journey that we're going on together, but you must map out your own course. You have to find your own way. You begin by asking, what if? When we think about the experiences of Peter here, I think there are several things that are relevant to us in this what if question. As we begin to try to understand his experience and see how it matches with that of our own. We've probably heard this story before if we've read Scripture very much, and honestly, I'm quite surprised that I've never spoken from this particular text. I think I've used this story from the other gospel, or I've referenced it before. When we think about this story, it's an amazing story. And there's storylines that we attach to it based on what we've heard before, and this morning, I want you to do that and to keep all of that, but I want you to ask something. I want you to ask a question. I want you to start asking this question when you read the stories in Scripture as you begin to understand the greater story of God. And that question is this: what if? What if? In Peter's experience, as they begin to move across the sea, and he's there with his disciples in the boat, they've been doing ministry together, and Jesus stayed around to dismiss the crowd. I do find it interesting that after that experience of being with the crowd, Jesus spent time alone. I think there's a lesson in there for us. I think there's something that we can learn from that experience. That while we meet together as a congregation and enjoy the fellowship and worship together at times, that we do need to spend time alone with God. And so we see that once again in Jesus' life and his experience. And then he comes to meet the disciples. It's in the middle of the night, or actually it's early in the morning. And they're on a part of the lake where storms do come up occasionally, where the cooler air meets the warm water, the storm occurs, and so the winds were high that night. Now, I've never been out on the sea for very long, and I've for sure never been in a small boat. Don't care to do either one of those, particularly at night. But that's their experience. That's something that was common to them. And so you would wonder why it is in that experience that they would be afraid. But they were. And as they're there together, having this experience together, they notice something coming at them, and they think it's a ghost. No, it's Jesus. And they have this experience with him. And as Peter recognizes Jesus, he says something to himself that maybe we ought to think about. What if? What if I get out of the boat? You see, probably this morning, many of us have spent an immeasurable amount of time in the boat. There's some comfort there. There's risk for sure. You're out on the sea and it's tossing the boat about. You think that there's ghosts out there, and so you're seeing things. So sometimes, even while you're in the boat, things cannot be very certain. But while you're there, have you ever wondered, what if I stepped out of the boat? What if I took my circumstances and began to change a course direction in my life? What if those things that I've been dreaming about or talking about and contemplating for a long period of time, what if that came to fruition in my life at this moment? What if I took a step out of the boat in my life? You know, it's hardest to do that when life is easy. I'm a what if kind of person. In fact, I've learned something in my long marriage to Sharon that I have to be careful about how I present what ifs to the family. Because I've always got ideas. I've always got something brewing, something I'm thinking about, something I would like to do. I'm sitting in the boat with a lot of like-minded friends, and I'm thinking, what the heck? What if, and then you can fill in the blank for a long period of years. Life was good for us. And we had reached a place where we had made a transition in life, and all of a sudden I sit myself down at the lunch table on a Sunday afternoon and I said, what if I gave my name to First Baptist Church Sweetwater as pastor? We got out of the boat. We took the opportunity to not just enjoy the comfort of where we were, but to leave that behind momentarily, to see what God was going to do next, to see what opportunities lied ahead for us. We looked at the limitations, and we overcame those limitations by taking the hand of God and moving into a new direction. What if in your life you stared down those limitations and you moved past those limitations? And you really began to experience in your life the unlimited possibilities of God. What if you walked on water? I noticed something about this story. As I began to think about the recurring themes that I've heard taught on since I've been a believer, and since I've heard many people speak about this passage. But let's not forget that when Peter took the opportunity to ask himself, what if I step outside the boat? He walked on water. The scripture says that. Look at that again. He walked on water. He may not have walked far. You see, that's what the critics would say. He didn't make it far. He eventually failed. They look at all the negative things that happened in his life, but he did something I've never done. He stepped out of the boat and he walked on water. What if? What if? I'm just saying, in your life, if you looked past the limitations, what if God has an opportunity for you to experience Him through walking on water in whatever experience that He has planned for you that you've not let Him develop in your life? Remember the guys that are still in the boat? Now, it's easy to speculate their thoughts. But I want you to remember this, that it's still a chaotic time. They're in a boat in the middle of the night. A storm has come up. They were crying with fear because they thought they saw a ghost. They may or may not have understood exactly what was about to happen when Peter called out to Jesus. Some of them could have been oblivious to what was about to happen. Some of them might not have heard him. But at some point, they begin to realize what's taking place, and they look up and they're seeing Peter raise his leg up over the boat and take himself over the boat, and he plants himself on water and he doesn't sink. The scripture says that he walked on water, and they're wondering, am I next? I want my turn. Sure, let's make Peter a target and say that they were just making fun of him. I don't think that's the case, because I think the way that God has created us and wired us, He wants us to walk with Him. And when we walk with Him, we walk in a way that we've never walked before. We walk like no one else. We walk like God intended for us to walk. And in our own way, when we live in the possibilities of Him, we walk on our own water in whatever we do. God is waiting for you to take a step out of your boat. What if? Let me just say this. Don't let it wait. Don't put it off. I had a conversation with someone this week about procrastination. And I just want you to know that I'm a world-class procrastinator. I can take it past the time that it was due. I'm pretty bad about it. I have excuses. I have several defenses for the reason that happens in my life. The bottom line, when I wake up in the morning, I'm still a procrastinator. But this is one area that I'm willing to take serious in my life. I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait to experience God and all the possibilities that He has for my life. I don't want to wait for God to miraculously show up and demonstrate His presence here with us. I want to be a part of that now, at this moment, in this experience with you. What if you got out of the boat? What if you walked on water? I know what you're thinking, because we're going to get to this point. What if I fail? If you don't fail, it just demonstrates that you've never tried. Simple as that. If you've never failed, then you have simply never tried. I'm not saying it's a goal of mine to wake up every morning and see how many ways that I can fail. But I will tell you, when I wake up in the morning, my intent is to get out of the boat and to walk on water, even if I fail. It's time to do that. There's no point in waiting for that. So we have this picture of Peter. He gets out of the boat, and sometimes we forget that he actually takes steps. He actually walked on water. And then he comes to that place where it says that he sees the wind and he sees the distractions, and those things begin to cause him to sink. In his experience, he's beginning to understand what all of us feel like at some point in our life, that measure of failure. And I know for him in that moment, it's happening in a split second. In that experience, in his failure, in his willingness to ask, what if I fail? We have this experience where the scripture says that Jesus reached out and He grabbed him. You see, what if you fail only to be rescued by the hand of God? Some of our failures are so minute that it will never require the hand of God. So if in this faith life you're just kind of playing around and you're following Jesus, you're kind of casual about it, or you're real comfortable with it, if you do find yourself in a place of risk and something doesn't go exactly right, it's probably not going to require the hand of God to rescue you. But let me tell you this. If you're willing to look at the what if in your life, and you're really willing to take the steps to walk with Him 100%, with complete surrender of your life, if you're willing to take those risks and put yourself in those positions in a God-given direction, you're going to experience a hand of God if you were to fail. Ben Cowan finishes a race. He finishes usually about 20 minutes after the first person or the pack has crossed the line. And you know, when we look at his life and we were to understand his story, it's sort of a magical story. But it's not a story of when the tough get going, or when the going gets tough, the tough get going. It's not a story of finish strong. But it's a story of staying in the race until when life gets so hard, there's someone there to rescue you. As the first person crosses the finish line in this race, they take their medal, they begin to peel back, and they find Ben, and they begin to run with Ben. And then the second place finisher, third, fourth, entire teams until ultimately, before Ben ever crosses the finish line, the entire group is running with him. And when he falls, he doesn't have to fall alone, and he doesn't have to pick himself up anymore. But they pick him up. And they set his feet, and he begins to run again. So in this experience of Ben, he doesn't cross the finish line alone. He crosses it with everyone who ran the race. When we think about what Jesus is doing in us, the image we ought to have is that we do not finish alone. If we run the race, we may feel alone. We may feel hurt. But when we get ready and we don't know what else to do, and we lift our hand up, someone rescues us. The hand of God rescues us, and we finish the race that He's charted for us. This has been a hard one this week. This has been tough. I've not just asked you to do something. I've had to live it myself. I've had to say, God, rescue me. This morning, you may need to be rescued. You may have never established a relationship with Christ. You may be waiting on something. And today could be that something. Would you let God this morning rescue you? Would you ask yourself what if and put yourself in a place looking beyond limitations where the only possibility of success is that God's going to rescue you? I believe it's time. Let me pray.